Hi, my name is Yuli and this is Nerd Alert. For today's video, I have prepared my review of the Poppy War, and this video is going to be very long by my estimate and very messy because I have notes both in my notebook and on my phone because I was reading the book and taking notes while I was reading it at home and after work, so that's why it's a bit all over the place. And I was also reading many other reviews of people with similar opinions to mine just to be able to put my opinion into words a bit better, because after finishing the book I was very confused and conflicted about how I felt about it. This video is going to be in many parts, and I'm going to have a long intro about the book as well, so I'm going to put timestamps in the description down below about everything, and I wouldn't recommend you to skip anything in this video just because I make a lot of things clear later on and in the beginning. So yeah, so before I start with like the whole thing, I will have a long intro about the book I'm reviewing, the Poppy War. I forgot to show it earlier when I introduced the video, but anyway, so the Poppy War is an adult fantasy written by R.F. Kuang. It is an own voices book written by a Chinese American author. It is inspired by real life events. It is based on the Second Sino-Japanese War that took place in 1937 and 1945, and that is as much as I know about the historical events of the book. I don't know anything about the historical events, and I personally don't particularly care about history in general, not necessarily about the history of this book, just in general. I'm not a history person, so I went into this book not knowing absolutely anything about the history behind it and about the book itself. The only thing that I knew about it is that it had a school setting, and halfway through it's changed. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of school settings, and I am not a big fan of all of the trigger warnings in the book. Now, it has a bunch of trigger warnings, and I'm probably going to put them on the screen, but the biggest ones are, for me, is graphic violence, but low-key off-page, brutal rape off-page, but described in a bit of detail, and a lot of substance abuse. And I'm going to get into some of those in more detail later on. There's some also like racism and stuff, and I will probably talk a little bit about them later on, but it's not going to be anything explicit because not many of these content warnings were actually explicitly in the book. They were either mentioned or very low-key in it. And I was worried about this book in the beginning. I didn't actually intend on reading it until earlier this year when I decided that I wanted to give it a chance. But I always had prejudice about the Poppy War because I knew about the school setting, and I don't usually like school settings. I think they have been overdone. I don't think they are anything original, and then every time I read about the school setting I don't like the book. And I also didn't like the fact that it included substance abuse because I don't like reading about substance abuse. Then Yuli, why did you read this book when you already knew you wouldn't like it? Well, it's because every time a new book comes out and it gets overhyped and I hear about it, I just automatically am of the opinion that I'm not going to like it, and I think I'm not going to like it, and therefore when I try to read it I don't like it because I'm already with the impression that I will hate it. So getting into this book, I decided that I actually wanted to read it. I wanted to see for myself how I would feel about it with no prejudice. And also, I'm always sad to say that I really like books, adult fantasy books written by female authors, because it just happens I have just a few series that I like that are written that are adult fantasy and written by female authors. So since this is one of those, I decided to read it because I really want to find new favorite female author to follow and read her books, but this sadly wasn't one of them, and I just really wanted to read it. So I shed all of my prejudice away. I just decided to take them away and get into the Poppy War with the hope that I would love it, or at least enjoy it, and I really wanted to enjoy it, but alas, I didn't. I also wanted to say something about this book. Now, obviously this book is an own voices book written by a Chinese American author, and it is and it includes some Asian culture in it, and I actually am very interested in Asian cultures, and I don't mind these kind of books. And also I believe that just because a book is written by an own voices author and is inspired by real life events doesn't mean that it necessarily automatically makes it good, and I'm going to tell you why I think so. But I'm reviewing this book as a piece of art. I will divide my review in two parts, and the first part is going to be very short, and that's because I'm going to talk about everything positive in the first part, and then I'm going to get to everything negative in the second part. And this is where I'm going to start with the review. And I again want to say before I start that this is going to be a spoiler-free review, or as spoiler-free as I can make it. I'm not going to summarize this book because I can't really explain what it's about. I'm just going to make a mess of it. I considered reading you the synopsis, but I again think that it's going to just get really messy real fast, and I don't want to do that to the book. I'm going to link the book down in the description, and I'm also going to link some Goodreads reviews that I liked. They're all, most or all of them are going to be reviews that I agree with, or that just say what I want to say about this book a bit better than I did. And again, I want to warn you guys that this is going to be a very messy and rambly review, mostly because of the way my notes are. As I said, they're in two different places and all over the place as well, so that's why it's going to be very chaotic, and that's why there are gonna be timestamps in the description down below. So without any further ado, let's get right into my review of this book. So the Poppy War is divided into three parts of the book, and as I said, I am not the biggest fan of school settings and training arcs and substance abuse, but I'll get to that. So the first part of the book includes the training arc and the school setting. And the things that I liked about the book were the fight scenes. They're very well described and well written. They were the most exciting thing that I read about, and I liked them the most. The other thing that I liked about the book was actually the school setting, which is very surprising for me, since I said like 3 times already that I don't like usually school settings. But the thing is that I didn't like the school setting here either. But the thing is that it was probably the best part of the book, because the book kind of sounds like it was 2 books in one, and they are kind of like written by 2 different people, and this is something that I saw in a lot of other Goodreads reviews, which basically said the same thing. So in one of the reviews that I read, it actually said that this book could have started off with the fighting scenes and then could have included Rin's past as flashbacks, and it would have been done a lot better because it is an adult fantasy novel, and for the first part it kind of reads like YA, like your typical YA. So yeah, for the first part of the book I was very confused. I was confused with how I felt about it because I didn't have an opinion, and I usually have a very strong opinion about books from the very beginning, and I know if I'm liking it or not liking it, or if I'm gonna like it. I just have some kind of an opinion. But while listening to this book, because I listened to it on an audiobook, and I'll explain why later in a bit, I just was confused. I didn't know if I was liking it or not. I was just listening to it and I was like, it's kind of basic and it's mediocre. It's nothing new. It's nothing new under the sun. Something that I wanted to say in the positive part of this review was that I actually appreciate the book for what it is, because it's obviously an own voices book inspired by real events, and I appreciate it for what it is, which means that it has like an all Asian cast, and a lot of people that haven't seen themselves in other books will probably kind of see themselves in this one. I am not discrediting it for what it is. As I said, I was feeling very neutral about the book for about halfway through it. I wasn't liking it, but I wasn't disliking it. I was kind of meh about it, and honestly I was alright with that, because I was hoping that the second part would pick up, because I knew that the first part of the book would be the school setting and the training arc, and then the second part would be everything else. And because of all of these trigger warnings, I just assumed that it would be a lot darker than it was. I was hoping this book would be so dark that it would make me feel sick from all of it, because when you see all of the trigger warnings, there's so many and they sound so bad. Like it just sounded like I would have to be in a very dark headspace for me to enjoy this book, because I was reading this one really grimdark book called The Darkness That Comes Before, and the whole trilogy is called The Prince of Nothing, and I really liked this trilogy, but it was so dark, it was so grimdark that it made me feel like kind of like something was wrong with me for liking that, because the world was so dark and the characters were so dark. None of the characters were good people, and none of the things that happened to them were good, and every time something kind of positive happened, it made you question yourself, is this really good, or is it some kind of a sick form of manipulation? That was the kind of dark it was. But this book isn't grim dark, it's just dark-ish. It's not even that dark. Most of the dark aspects of it and most of the trigger warnings are kind of vague. And for a book with this many trigger warnings, I just wanted to have them all on page-ish, kind of. Of course, if they had all been on page, it would have been even worse. In most grimdark books, all of the content warnings would have been on page and not off page, because most of them were off page. There is, for example, some of them are for racism, but obviously I can't really talk about that in detail because obviously I can't exactly explain it. But what the racism was mostly colorism, because Rin is a village girl from the south and she's going to somewhere else to study in her elite school. So obviously people were kind of bullying her, and what would they bully her on? They would bully her on the color of her skin, because she is darker skinned than most of the others. And it wasn't on page. It wasn't as bad as it could have been. It wasn't as bad as it should have been for a grimdark book. As I said, I'm not saying that racism is good or that it should be in the book, but for a grimdark book, it was kind of tame. And people who have read it and are listening to me right now may be like, Yuli, what do you mean it was tame? It wasn't. It was brutal, and there are some brutal descriptions of scenes, but it's off page, and to me that it doesn't make it grimdark. It's just kind of dark. And yeah, I will probably get a bit more in detail about this, but I'm already kind of like digressing from what I was supposed to talk about because of all of my messy notes. I want to talk about the first part of the book for now, and this is the school setting. It's your typical school setting with the typical bullying. Rin is a village girl who obviously is kind of like marries you because everything goes well for her. Actually, in one of the reviews I saw a comparison of the Poppy War to the Name of the Wind, and honestly I can kind of see it, because both Rin and Kvothe are kind of similar-ish, but Rin is a bit in a darker atmosphere, so she is a bit like more morally grey than Kvothe. But it is no secret that she accomplished everything very easily, because basically the book begins with her selling illegal substances for profit of her family. She's a war orphan, so the people who are taking care of her are foster parents or something like that, and because they care more about profit than her, they try to marry her off to some guy who is 3 times her age, and Rin doesn't want that, so she tries to get into this elite school for like soldiers or whatever, and she doesn't have the proper education for that, so she's trying to learn everything that she's missed in a very limited amount of time, and of course she does it, and of course she scores the first place among her village when she doesn't have any formal education. And this is the first Mary Sue-ish thing, and later on when she gets into the academy, she's actually kind of is okay. Like, her character while she's in the school is okay. She kind of gets shocked with how little she knows and strives to achieve more and learn more, and I actually really liked that she was trying to learn a lot more. Now, a lot of people may not actually like the fact that her actual studying isn't shown on page, but it's kind of retold, but I, as a person who doesn't like school setting and the training arc, was okay with that. However, I also see the problem with off-page learning, because you don't show the journey, you just show the result of it, which can be kind of underwhelming, because we see her lose a battle, get motivated to learn, and then we see her win everything else and be the best of the best. And I didn't like how fast she became the best of the best, because again, she always gets what she was she achieves things very quickly and gets things that she sometimes doesn't deserve, and obviously it was needed for the plot, and I still don't know how I feel about it. I still find the school setting kind of basic and cliche because it's already been done before, and if you're a fan of school settings and of this particular type of thing, then I understand why you would like the whole first part and why you wouldn't like the second part. And if you don't like the school setting, I would understand why you would like the second part, and I'm here to tell you why both of them weren't to my taste. In the school setting, they respect the drama and bullying, and I didn't like it, of course. She makes a mortal enemy right off the bat, and what I actually really didn't like about that was that later on they fight together, and I actually really enjoyed the fight scenes where she was fighting with Naja. I actually really enjoyed it because it kind of showed how even though you don't like each other at the time of war, at a life or death situation, two people can work together to kind of like overcome a common enemy and then go back to being enemies. However, I didn't like the development of their so-called relationship. Now, this is not a romantic relationship that I mean, just a relationship between characters, kind of like an acquaintanceship of sorts. I just didn't like that development at all because it came almost out of nowhere. And as I was saying, I understand that two enemies can work together to overcome a common enemy, but then they immediately kind of became friends, and to me that really threw me off because I didn't expect it. But I liked the first time they were introduced to like real life stakes, as in life or death stakes, and like the shock and how she was surprised and all that. However, something that I didn't like, and this reminded me of animes, you know how in animes characters have a secret like ace up in their sleeves and they wait until everybody is almost dead before they show the ace up their sleeves. But in this case it was like Rin had just almost lost her first fight and was about to be killed, and that's when her teacher Jung showed up and just kind of low-key tried to save the day. I don't know if he succeeded or not, and I just found it weird. Like, it's usually like you wouldn't show your ace immediately, but at the same time it's wartime, so of course you would try to win as fast as possible. So I was kind of conflicted, but this is just from my personal taste, because in fact a lot of the things that I'm saying right now is my opinion and not objective. I'm talking purely subjectively just because I like to be subjective and not objective. But obviously I have some objective things thrown in here and there. So another thing that I want to mention is that halfway through the book, while they're in the academy, we have one cast of characters and they aren't really that well developed. And in the second part of the book, we change cast of characters because she goes to the Psych, which is an elite people, assassins that have special powers, because of course that our main character isn't like other girls or other soldiers in that fact. No, she's the last of her kind. Of course she is. Just like her hero Alton, who is also the last of his warrior kind, who were obliterated in one of the previous Poppy Wars, and of course they're both the last of their kinds. I didn't really have a problem with the fact that we changed cast of characters halfway through the book, because I already didn't care about the old characters and I didn't care about the new characters, so it was all the same to me. But for the people who had actually managed to somehow get attached to the first characters, of course they didn't like that, and I totally understand that. If I had gotten attached to the characters in the first part of the book and then suddenly go switch to new characters in the second part, I would be kind of thrown off. I would low-key miss the characters from the first part and not really care about the characters in the second part. But as I said, I find them equally underdeveloped. And something that I noticed was that obviously this book is written in the third person, but it has only a single point of view, which is very limiting for a high fantasy, for an adult fantasy at that. If it was YA, I would understand it, but this book is marketed as adult fantasy, and I think that it's marketed and categorized as adult fantasy only because of how brutal and violent it is and nothing else. Because honestly, it could be any other basic YA book and it wouldn't make any difference. And that's probably why I didn't like it that much, because I'm not into YA and I'm not into basic books, and this was basically it. So yeah, I just find a singular point of view in an adult fantasy to be very limiting because what happened with it was that Rin was kind of developed as a person as a character, and the story was developed well enough, but the other characters were just two-dimensional and had no personality, and they didn't have any meaning. I didn't like any of them, I didn't care about any of them because they just weren't really well developed. We didn't know anybody's motivation or anything, and because there is this uh, time jump in the book where she starts in the academy and then she just graduates from it, we don't get to know any of the characters at all, and therefore I didn't really care about any of them. And since we don't see any of their points of views, I couldn't care less about anything that happened to them. Now let's move off to the characters and mostly Rin. Now I didn't like Rin for the majority of the time. In the beginning I was just kind of meh about her and thought she was just basic, just like your usual typical YA character who just gets everything her way. And Rin is no different. As I said, she kind of has like a tougher backstory than most YA characters, and obviously I know this book is adult. So for the majority of the books, I was actually kind of confused why there were so many trigger warnings, because for the first part there was nothing that would make me think that there were anything wrong with it. In the school again, it was just your basic bullying, and it wasn't, as I said, even that detailed. And then in the second part, it started getting a bit more clear why there were trigger warnings, but until chapter 21, where it's like something truly brutal is described in past tense, because it's off page, I didn't really think that there was need for any content warnings. So that was that. As I said, I'm going to talk about Rin now, and I just really don't like her. In the beginning, I didn't want to say that I didn't like her, just because I didn't really have an opinion of her. I didn't know why I wasn't like her. I didn't have an idea what was wrong with her, but after finishing the book, I finally realized what was wrong with her, and I honestly get it now. Rin is my polar opposite. She is very emotional in the worst way possible. She acts on emotion. She is insubordinate. She doesn't take advice. She is immature. And I'm going to actually quote Brandon Sanderson and say, it's not like a very good like quotation, but his quote from, I think it was The Way of Kings, goes as follows: to have emotions is to be human, but to act on every emotion is to be a child. And this second half of the quote describes Rin perfectly, because she's such a child. She is, honestly, she is okay in the first half of the book. She's still not the best, but she's okay-ish. She's a bit more rational, a bit more logical, and she tries her best to be the best. However, in the second part of the book, and the third part as well, she just becomes the whiniest, the most immature, irrational person ever. And yeah, a friend of mine, shout out to Uday, who actually told me that you can't expect teenagers to be emotionally stable and rational during war, and you can't expect them to be that all the time. But the thing is, this is not her first time being confronted with something terrible. This is not her first time being in the front lines. This is not her first time fighting against an enemy. She had so many years in that academy, school, or whatever it is, to learn how to control her emotions, because what was she training for? Like, they were trained how to fight, how to do, and all of that, and it was supposed to prepare them for the war. And of course you can never be truly prepared for a war, and of course you can be irrational and afraid and all of that. I am fine with that. What I didn't like was that she was acting on every single one of her emotions. It didn't matter that it was on the battlefield or not. She was always irrational. She was always just annoying to me personally, and I didn't like the decisions she made. She was ignoring advice, she was making the bad decisions, she was insubordinate, and if I had been younger, I would have sympathized with her. I would have been like, oh yeah, I agree with her and everybody else is at fault. But I'm not, and I don't take this shit, because I have read way too many books like this, and I like to be more of a logical thinker. That's why I said that she is my polar opposite, because I like to think with my head and not with my feelings, and she thought with her feelings. And I just didn't like that, because just because of that, like everything would go bad for her, and that's how she made bad decisions. But as I said, she was insubordinate. She took rank for absolutely nothing. She didn't care. It's always somebody else was at fault and not her. It was always somebody else's fault and not hers. And that's why I didn't like her. That's why I don't like Voss from the Name of the Wind, because it's always somebody else's fault and not his fault. And Rin was absolutely the same. Like, I'm okay with the main character being insubordinate when it makes sense. For example, when the main character knows that they are correct, that what they offer, they are like captain, lieutenant, or whatever, is right, and that they're going to win, then of course it's gonna be fine. So I'm okay with that. But when they're insubordinate for the sake of being insubordinate and just because they're kind of selfish, that's when I'm not okay with it. That's when it doesn't make sense, because you have rank for a reason. But I also have a problem with that, because you see, there are like about 10 people with special powers. She is among them, and Alton, who I already mentioned once, if you don't remember, is another guy, and they are commander, general, or whatever, died. So he gets appointed as the commanding person of the psych, and I somehow can't understand how in this whole country there wasn't one person with enough military experience who could be at the head of the psych before him. How is he, a youngster who can't be more than 22, how could he be the most qualified person to be the leader when he was obviously mentally unstable? And I have like a whole thing to talk about that as well, just because I really didn't like the magic system, and I digress again. But yeah, basically, Alton has like, he had so much potential in my opinion as a character, but he was done dirty like a lot. I think that he was one of the most interesting characters. Yeah, I really liked her first impression of him, because she just saw him as a person who's very good at fighting, and he wasn't drugged, because she also thinks like drugs are a real like thing in that thing, like a very big thing. And I was going to say why I didn't like reading about drugs, and that is because it just I really don't, it's not my thing, and I don't care how historically accurate it is. I don't like it, just like I don't like reading about rapists. Like, I don't care how historically accurate it is. I just don't like it. And in this book specifically, I just feel like it was kind of like not my thing. There could have been a different way to show the substance abuse thing that was kind of like a thing in that time. I will get to that in a second. But yeah, Alton was an interesting character who wasn't as developed as I wanted him to be. He wasn't as interesting as I wanted him to be, and I just have liked a bit more about him. I can't even talk about him too much without spoiling anything, so that's why I'm not talking about him. So the magic system is basically you get drugged, you get magic, and later on we kind of like find a bit more about it, but it is kind of underdeveloped, and I just don't like it because again of the drugs. I don't think that relying on something to get magic or to be able to control your magic is something good. Again, it's a very kind of like a dark magic system that has consequences, which is good because basically they get drugged in order to kind of like access the gods and be able to talk to them, and the gods give them power or something like that. But the gods also end up corrupting your mind and making you go crazy or insane, which is kind of like a good consequence of using the magic or overusing your magic. And so for some people, they would end up using the drugs to kind of like be able to stay sane and use the magic, as opposed to being able to hear the gods' voices and just getting insane, more and more insane. I found this a very interesting aspect, but again, I don't like the drug thing. So this is my own personal preference. I didn't like the way it was done. I think that just because it's like substance abuse is something very serious and it has very serious consequences. Like I want to like, because there was substance abuse in the content warnings, I expected to be dealing with addiction. Like I expected to be reading about heavy addictions because it's grimdark, so of course there should be some kind of heavy addiction, but there wasn't. Like there wasn't any addiction. Like I expected Rin to at least kind of like start craving the poppy seeds or whatever kind of drug she was using. I expected at least one of the side characters to be craving the poppy seeds or whatever kind of drug they were using, and to like show clear signs of addiction. But no, there wasn't any addiction to like their substance abusing at all. That's my problem. That was my problem. It was like it wasn't as realistic as it should have been. It wasn't as dark as it should have been. That's why I'm saying that this is not a grimdark book, because for a grimdark book to be grimdark, the world has to be messed up. Yes, the war was a very brutal thing. I actually found a Goodreads review that explained and said that the violence scenes, especially from chapter 21, were actually depicted and taken from like real events that actually happened the way they were described in the book. And when I read that, the review is also written by another Chinese American person who is interested and knows their history. So yeah, I decided to trust that review, but again, I am taking it with the benefit of the doubt, just because of how how uninformed I am, and I recognize that. As I said, I don't really care about history that much, but the fact that she said that it was basically taken more or less word for word from like what actually happened wasn't exactly creative at all, especially for a fantasy novel. But what I don't like is that it was, as I said multiple times already, it was off page. It wasn't described as it was happening. Rin didn't witness it. Rin didn't live it. She got told about it, about everything, about the brutal rape that happened, that was obviously something terrible, and type of violence that happened. But she didn't, as I said, witness it or experience it. She didn't do anything. She was just there, kind of like she was kind of told about it. And that's what I didn't like, because this is not grimdark. This is not even dark. This is just somebody retelling you a very brutal story. And yes, it was brutal. Yes, like the real life events are terrible. And I'm not saying that the main character or anybody should go through that. No, of course not. But when your book is grimdark, your world is messed up. All of your characters are morally grey. Not just one or two. All of them are morally grey. Everything is dark. And those content warning things happen on page. Like, honestly, I am not saying that I want to read something like that at all. That's why I say that I would probably not recommend the Prince of Nothing series to people, even if they do like grimdark, just because it's so dark. Like, all of the content warnings in this book happen on page in The Prince of Nothing, on page multiple times, and they're described like in detail. And I felt sick while I was reading that, because I also enjoyed reading it. In like a sick part of me liked reading that, even though it was so terrible and I wouldn't like to read it in any other book. But it's grimdark, and that is what makes it grimdark. The atmosphere, the world, the characters, everything about it was bad, dark, and just not good. While in this book, while you don't really get a clear good versus evil thing, because obviously the country Rin is from is like the changed name for China, and the country the Mugen, however you pronounce the enemy country, is obviously a stand-in for Japan. It was kind of like clear that the Rin's country was supposed to be the good guys, and the Mugen country was supposed to be the bad guys. But when it comes to the characters, it wasn't exactly clear like who I was supposed to be rooting for, because I didn't really like Rin. She isn't the type of character that I can root for, or even when I dislike a character, I still can see like their kind of like low-key redeeming qualities or anything like that. And like at one point I started even wondering if Rin was supposed to be kind of like a villain or something, especially at the end of the book. But I just don't know. She's not like a good person. She's a bad person. She's just an angry person. She's a selfish person. She wants power for the sake of power. She just wants to feel powerful because she's a village girl, so obviously she has a ton of so yeah, she got like bullied for like her being from the south and all that, but she also recognized her weakness in the beginning of the book, so she wanted to improve herself. She wanted to get power so she could be on par with everybody else around her. But then later on in the second part of the book, she kind of switched personality. The pacing was a bit off as well, because it started moving really fast and all of the events started happening almost all at once, and she just started wanting power for the sake of power. Even against Odin, who she was looking up to in the first half, she started wanting to just be better than him for the sake of being better than him and stronger than him. like he also wasn't the best person out there, and the way it was kind of described at one point, I started getting worried that Autumn and Nojo would be her love interest just because of the way it was written, and I'm so glad that they weren't. But honestly, it was kind of like every time I was reading about her kind of admiring both of them, I was like, no. So another thing that I really didn't like about this book, and this is again about violence, I again go back to the violence, was that a lot of it was for shock factor. But in this book, I feel like the violence and especially the rape were part of Rin's reason for motivation, and that is what I don't like, because we all complain that in old fantasy, for like, there would be one female character who would get raped as as a device for the male main character's motivation and character growth. And in this book, exactly the same thing happened, save for the fact that Rin is a girl and she got motivated by a fellow girl's sexual assault to do whatever she did, kind of. But another big problem is that a lot of the characters who that I don't even know how to explain it. Basically, the the character with the sexual assault in this case was the character from the first part of the book that we didn't really see much. I don't even think that she had a good relationship with Rin, so Rin shouldn't even care about her. And like, we didn't see her for the majority of the book until that happened, so I didn't even remember who she was. But Rin for some reason cared about her, and I'm like, why shouldn't you want to treat you while you weren't friends? Like, why do you care about a random person who you just happen to go to school with? You know, like, obviously, as I said, what happened to that character is terrible, but it just isn't somebody who we as the reader care about either. So I don't know why she was like that. Basically, the author uses the wrong characters to motivate Rin and kills off the right characters whose story arcs haven't finished. And I didn't even realize this was a problem with the book. Like, I knew that there was something wrong when the author started killing off characters that just didn't feel like they should be killed off just yet, and then used other characters who should have been dead by now as like plot device. I just didn't realize that problem was until I read it in the review, just because I was like, oh, there's something wrong, but I really don't care about it to actually realize what the problem was. And yeah, yeah, there was like a lot wrong with all of this, in my opinion. As I said, this is subjective, and just because you don't like this book doesn't mean that I'll judge anybody who likes it. Actually, one of my friends enjoyed it a lot more than I did, and like a few other friends and people who I follow on Instagram enjoyed this book way more than I did. And of course, they also like Asian inspired fantasy, and while I don't dislike it, I just haven't found a book, like an Asian inspired book, that I like just yet. So yeah, that sounds terrible, but it is true. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I have still a lot other things to say about this book. Like, I'm probably going to remember about a lot more things that need to be said after I finish filming, but honestly, this is it for now. I swear I actually like most of the books that I read, but oh my god, I always go into books hoping that I would like them, even if they're books that I think that might not like. I just hope I will like them, but for the majority of the time I just didn't feel anything about this book, and then I really started disliking it, especially at the end when it was supposed to be the most interesting part. I just really lost interest in it, and especially at the very end with Rin's last action, I just really didn't like that at all. Mostly, I mean, I wasn't supposed to like her decision, but as I said, didn't she doesn't think with her head. That's my biggest problem. I know that obviously I'm not expecting everybody to think with their heads and to be like mentally stable during war, but still, I just would have preferred for her to stop and consider what the consequences of her actions would be. Now, I don't know if I'm going to continue with this trilogy. I actually have the e-arc for the Burning God, that's why I decided to finally read the Poppy War, and I am curious enough to continue with the Dragon Republic. But if I do, I'm going to read it in October after one of my Stormlight rereads, and I'm probably going to listen to the audiobook again. So as for my rating, for the majority of this book, I wanted to give it 3 stars, especially for the school. Not because I thought it was good enough for 3 stars, but because it was so basic that I didn't know what other rating to give it, save for the safe middle. But after finishing the book, I was more on the 2.5 stars thing, and the more I thought about it, the more I read about it, and the more I am talking about it on this video, I realized that 2 stars is probably the most accurate rating I could give it at this point in time, and I might change my mind later on. We will see. I still don't really know. So for right now, I will say that I'm giving it 2 stars as my final rating. Just because I didn't like this book doesn't mean that I'm going to judge you if you liked it. I'm actually glad that my friends enjoy it. Like, I am usually the unpopular opinion, as you might notice on this channel. I usually don't like popular books, and that's why I'm afraid of reading so many of them. I definitely understand the hype. I definitely understand why people would like it. I do, like, I really do. And I believe that if I had been a bit younger, maybe if I had been 15 to 17, I would have probably loved this book and been terrified of what happened in chapter 21 and later on at the end of the book. But in this case, I have read way too many books to be impressed by it and to actually enjoy it as much. And yeah, that's basically it. I am again bummed that I didn't enjoy it for many reasons. Some of them being that this is a book written by a female author and it's an own voices book as well. And I tend to DNF own voices books, not because I can't relate to them or anything, it's just because I find the stories mediocre at best usually, and I get bored. The reason I listened to the audiobook for this book was because I was working and I was listening to the audiobook while I was working, because I'm a housekeeper, so I'm just mindlessly doing stuff so I can listen to it. And I also believe that if it hadn't been for the audiobook, I would be still stuck on page 150 or something, and would have probably either DNF'd the book or had so many notes here that I would have ended up making an even longer review. And as I was starting to say, I usually DNF adult fantasy books written by female authors because I don't usually tend to like them, and the few that I like are actually the Devabat trilogy and the Night Runner series. So these are so far the only ones that I like by female authors, and I'm so bummed about the fact that I didn't like this book because I really wanted to enjoy it. I am interested in Asian cultures and Asian inspired books and fantasy, but this just wasn't it for me. It just wasn't the right book for me, I guess, and I recognize that. It is, of course, I knew that the first half wouldn't be to my taste just because of the school setting and all that, but I hope that the second half would be a bit better, and it is kind of better if you like more action and more fights, but I just don't like senseless fighting and fighting for no reason either. I do enjoy the fight scenes, the way she describes them. I really like those. So if for nothing else, I would read the Dragon Republic for the fights, because I also heard that it's mostly battles anyway. So I will definitely read the second book, maybe, if I feel like it. I contradict myself, okay, I know. But yeah. Okay, so tell me, what is your opinion of the Poppy War? If you have read it, do you want to read it? And please don't let my review discourage you from reading the book. If anything, please read it to kind of see if you would agree or disagree with me. And let's have a nice and respectful chat in the comments if you want to discuss this book with me as well. And yeah, if you liked my review of the Poppy War, please give it a like and comment. Subscribe to our channel for more videos twice or more a week, and click that bell to notify you every time we upload a new video. And yeah, that was it, guys, and see you soon.